everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on food waste attitudes and behaviours in Ireland, where you will hear about consumer insights for grocery retailers. My name is Odile Le Bolloch, and I'm a scientist working in the EPA's Circular Economy programme, and I've responsibility for delivering activities that relate to food waste prevention, textiles, and also research that provides evidence and insights to inform our work. I'd just like to draw your attention to some housekeeping matters. So please turn off your cameras and mute your microphone when you enter the webinar and for the duration of the event. The presentation section of this webinar will be recorded and we'll share it on the EPA's YouTube channel after the event. Please feel free to put any questions you have for the speakers using the Q&A function. The chat function is disabled, but you can put your questions into Q&A, and then once we stop recording the presentation, we will move to the Q&A section. And if you are experiencing any technical issues, try leaving and rejoining the webinar. We find that tends to work for most people. Great. So thank you, everybody, and welcome. I'd like to welcome you all today to our webinar, where we're delighted to be able to share some insights from our behavioural science research. And I suppose the EPA has been working on behavioural science in the Circular Economy programme. We established the programme back in 2000, and the idea is it provides us with some evidence that helps us inform policy and stakeholders, and it also helps us identify behavioural change interventions and also inform awareness campaigns that we do. And the main approaches that we have been using, we've been working with Ipsos B&A over a number of years, and we've been using nationally representative quantitative research, which tells us what people say they do and what they think. We've also been doing some qualitative research, and that's through things like focus groups, ethnographic studies, which tells us a little bit more about why people think that they act the way they do. And I suppose the team, as subject matter experts, have been working with Ipsos B&A to design the research to find out, to identify what we want to know more about, and also help identify work that's coming up. And as part of that, then Ipsos B&A work with us. They devise the methodology and make sure that everything is done in accordance with relevant methodologies and nationally representative sampling. We have also done some work, some experimental behaviour science in relation to campus, and we've worked with the Irish Universities Association. That tells us a bit more how behaviours can change under different conditions. So just in terms of our, we publish our reports from our research and the associated data, and you'll find them. We have a link there on the slide to where we publish them on our website. And as well as that, we also disseminate the findings to the relevant stakeholder groups, and we use it also to inform our work, as I've mentioned. And here you can see the range of research we've done on the topics, including food waste. We've also done work on textiles, repair, reuse, plastics, and as mentioned, the link there is on our website where you can find out more. So I suppose, like most complex environmental problems, food waste covers a huge range of issues, and there isn't a single solution. And sometimes it can be difficult not to be overwhelmed and try and solve all the different aspects at the same time. So while it is tempting to talk about the bigger picture, today we want to zoom in and distill some of the research findings into one particular area. And we're going to look at consumer insights in relation to food waste, but presented through the lens of the grocery retail environment. And it is good to see so many of you here today. I do notice that we have representatives from businesses from a number of different sectors along the supply chain. So I'd just like to take the opportunity, maybe for those of you who may be interested in taking part in some of our other food waste focused programs. Maybe you might consider signing the Food Waste Charter and join like-minded businesses who are tackling their food waste. And businesses that sign the charter pledge to measure, reduce and report on their food waste. And there's resources on the website foodwastecharter.ie, which can help businesses get started to measure and identify actions to reduce food waste in your business. So if you'd like to check out there, we also run related webinars and events. So you might find one that will help you get moving on that journey. So without further ado, I'd like to invite John O'Mahony from Ipsos B&A to turn on his camera and microphone and share his slides.
Thank you very much, Odile.
So
Good
just by
morning.
way of introduction, John is a director at Ipsos B&A and he's over 20 years experience in market research, and he specializes in large-scale quantitative studies, behavioral insight, and translating complex data into clear, actionable narratives for non-research audiences. He works extensively across food and retail sectors and is a long-standing columnist for Checkout magazine, where he tracks monthly grocery shopping trends from spend patterns and in-store pain points to the rise of high-protein products. So John is the Ipsos B&A account director for our EPA Circular Economy Research Programme, and we've been working with him and the Ipsos team for a number of years on national studies that inform policy, communications and on-the-ground practice. Recent projects include our food waste surveys, also baseline national textile survey. We had textile proposition study, qualitative research into secondhand clothing, and national repair survey and reuse survey. So John has been involved in us on this journey. And then obviously beyond circular economy, John has also worked with our EPA colleagues in the climate section on the EPA Yale climate change and the Irish mine studies as well. So we're delighted to have John here today with us, and he has very graciously pulled together this presentation for us. So today, John, you're going to share with us some consumer insights in relation to food waste behaviours based on findings from a number of research studies that we've conducted together. Could you summarise the research that underpins this and share what studies you drew on to pull together this comprehensive view?
Thank you very much, Odile. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to work with you and the team with Anne-Marie and Fiona in the Circular Economy Programme. Um, and yes, let me tell you um, what we've drawn on for this study. It sort of synthesizes a number of studies we've done for you over recent years. There's four in particular, and they're both consumer research and B2B research, just to give you a flavor of what we've reviewed in particular for this presentation. So there's a food waste national survey. Now that really gives us an overview of the behaviour and attitudes of Irish adults in relation to awareness and behaviours of food waste. And we've done that for a number of years. And so not only do we have the findings from 2024, which gives us absolute measures, we can also compare them and see what measures have gone up, what measures have gone down, to give us an idea of what the dynamic is. In addition, then, to build on that national survey, we also did a qualitative study, which had a very innovative approach, as as Odile mentioned. It used an innovative digital diary ethnographic approach to really give us a fly in the wall perspective on household food waste. And then, in addition to that, we had B2B research. This was another qualitative study. It was a project designed to understand food waste practices within the food manufacturing industry. And then finally, there was another national survey that we conducted amongst the public, and it was focused on consumer usage and attitudes towards single-use packaging for fruit and vegetables. So what you have there is a series of studies that either had a general or quite a specific focus, but all of them were in the area of food waste. Now, what we've done for this report is to aggregate and synthesize those findings together to give you an overall insight into the picture of food waste in Ireland in relation to both consumers, but also businesses. So if I was just to give you a sort of a top line, an executive summary of what we're going to go through today, the first area would be the consumer mindset. Now, in particular there, you have this high concern. Um, while the price of food remains the biggest food issue for people, that's 77%, food waste is the second most significant issue, with 53% citing it as a key concern. And then, in addition to that, you have environmental awareness. A strong majority, 81%, see a clear link between throwing away food that could have been eaten and climate change, indicating a receptive audience for sustainability initiatives. Now, then, in addition to the consumer mindset that we established quantitatively, you've also got these key findings in relation to the drivers of waste. So household food waste is consistently driven by this mix. And the mix involves either poor planning, confusion over date labels, and then there's this gap in food management skills. And we've devoted a full section on that later in this presentation. And in addition to that, you have ingrained purchasing habits that often start in store. And then furthermore, when you look at motivators and barriers, you have a primary motivator for change. The most powerful incentive for consumers is financial. Now they have deep care for environmental issues as well, but it's the potential. When we tested out various measures, it was the potential to save around €700 a year that was the most persuasive for them. And then there's also, if that's the key motivator, they also have a primary barrier to change, and that is this competency gap that I already mentioned. It's significant and it exists where consumers lack the practical skills to effectively plan, but not only plan, it's also to store and use the food they buy. So, if that's an overall summary, here's what we'll take you through. We have section one, which is understanding household food waste in Ireland. Then we have section two, which is public attitudes, behaviours, and competencies. Then we have section three, which, as I mentioned, is that focus on the competency gap. But to supplement that, what's really important is in addition, you have this willingness to improve. And then from section four, we'll look at the key insights overall, and that'll bring in both the consumer work we did and the B2B work.
Lovely. That's great, John. It looks like you're going to take us on a great journey. So could you just start maybe by painting a picture for us on the attitudes towards household food waste in Ireland and kind of how much people say they're wasting, who's wasting the most, and what specific types of food do they say they waste the most?
Oh, yeah, Odile, this is where we see this. I suppose it's a fundamental misunderstanding, also combined by this not a contradiction, but just a misapprehension by consumers around not only what is food waste, but also how much food they do actually waste. And that's where it was really helpful for us to combine quantitative insights with then the results from that qualitative study, the ethnographic study, where we actually, were really inside people's houses and got a first-hand view of how they actually treat food and how much they actually waste. So if we look at the public understanding, we have, when we say food waste for people, what the quantitative data reveals is that there's no single clear understanding of what it is. There's no consensus about what the term food waste actually means. Now, when you prompt them, about 2 in 3 people will actually correctly identify that it's food placed in a brown bin as waste. But there's a need for public education to clarify that food waste is any food, that could have been eaten that is thrown away. And then as I said, in the ethnographic research, what we confirm there is the foods that consumers can just instinctively exclude, and those would be composted food. And when they do that, when they exclude that, they minimize their perceived impact. Here's a quote directly from the ethnographic study. It goes in the compost bin. To be completely honest with you, I would consider that food waste. It's getting composted. So that's a sort of in this area, then you have this fundamental misapprehension about what even constitutes food waste. Now, in terms then of self-reported food waste levels and key demographics, here's where we get into the area that this is a national issue, but it also has a key target group. So last year when we did this, 29% of the population reported wasting a moderate or a large amount of food. 29%. However, the figure masks a significant demographic trend, and that was younger consumers say they are wasting more, while those over 55 say they waste less. Let me show you this in actual breakdown in absolute numbers. So if you just look at here, this is the absolute number who say they report moderate to large waste levels. And then here's the age groups. So it's 29% nationally, but it goes up to 44% amongst young adults. And in research, we refer to those, anyone under 35 as a young adult. So you can see how much it goes up, and then it declines with age, 35% amongst the middle age group in research terms. And then for the more senior audience, senior adults, it drops to 19%. So a full 10% below the national average. So what you've got here, in terms of a national issue of food waste, is also then supplemented by there being this specific target group, which is younger shoppers. Now, how might we describe younger shoppers? Well, they're often time poor, and by definition, they may have less experience in actual food management. But this is the group who's most in need of guidance, the most in need of tools and offerings that help them reduce waste. Now, in addition to that, that's the overall picture in terms of food waste. But what is being wasted and why? And as I said, with the national survey on food waste, we've done a number of iterations of it now. And the key food types that are being most frequently discarded are so consistent over time. And there are four. The top one, and you can probably guess these. I should have asked you actually to guess what the first one was, but it's bread. Top one, always has been. And that 48% underneath the figure there, that's the percentage of people who report often wasting this type of food. So I'm going to put up the second one here, but you might guess what it is before I do. Did you say fruit? Then you're absolutely right. Slightly behind the incidence of wasting bread, but very strong. Over 40% of us say that we often waste this type of food. And then close behind, fractionally behind, is vegetables. Fruit and vegetables following on from bread. And then the final one is a variation on that theme, really. It's salad. And I imagine that irrespective of how many times we do the Food Waste National Survey, you'll find that quartet of food categories topping the list as those that are wasted more often. But if you're looking for one in particular, it's bread. 50%, just under 1 in 2 of us say that we waste this food often. So if that's not being wasted, let's find out a little bit about the why. And we can start by the results from the quantitative research. There are 3 key reasons why we waste so much food. And the first one is that food has passed its use by date. Over 2 in 3 of us say that. So use by date is absolutely a key trigger for our discarding of food. And you might have expected that. Then some way back, but again, a very prominent reason, second overall, is our plans changing. 53% of us say that. And then the final one is a sort of our attempt to be good, package leftovers, we pop them in the fridge with the good intention of using them again. However, again, over half of us say the key reason why we waste food is that we don't use them in time. Yeah, leftovers not being used in time. So those are the results from the quantitative survey. But again, we can supplement those with key insights from the qualitative study, the ethnographic research, where we're actually in people's homes. And there are other triggers that are very important to people. And that the top one there would be appearance and feel. Yeah. Well, the classic one, as you can probably guess, is bananas turning brown or going soft. But it also relates to other fruits naturally and other vegetables. And it's one of those key reasons that fruit and vegetables and salad that we saw in the preceding chart are so prominent in being thrown out. Then duration of time in the fridge felt to be too long. That's more of it's not as if we're keeping a record of when we put it in the fridge, typically. But it's just more of an instinctive feel that it's been too long in there, if you like. And it's directly related to that third point at the top there corner of the chart about leftovers not being used in time. And then again, we go back to a more explicit visual inspection, such as mold, etc. And that's particularly related to bread, I think. So you look at that, taking in the what and the why. It highlights really two areas in particular. There are others, but two areas in particular where consumers need particular support. Clear date labels isn't naturally vital. And then by having solutions that offer great time flexibility and are not as impacted by changing plans. So what might we mean there? Greater time flexibility and not as impacted by changing plans. Well, that's where the classic larder or the pantry, or however you might describe it, comes into play. And that being well stocked with non-perishable foods can be really facilitate the consumer there. And also then the role of the freezer and the pause button that is the freezer, and moving and understanding what foods can be frozen. And actually, we're doing a survey for that for Odile and the team right now. Those are two ways. So, in terms of overall attitudes, understanding of food waste, those would be key findings.
Lovely. Thanks, John. And I'm sure we can all kind of recognize ourselves in those as well. Bread, definitely something that gets thrown out a lot. And even just in terms of, yeah, plans changing, the constant challenge really, isn't it? That sort of thing. So I suppose moving on then, can you tell us a bit more about the public's mindset and the kind of their general attitudes towards food waste and how it lines up with their actual behaviours? And then you mentioned the competencies, these kind of skills that they've assessed that they have.
Yeah, I'll give absolutely a deal. What I'll do here in this section is give you sort of an overview of attitudes, behaviors, and competencies. And then the next section, I'll really focus on the competencies. But this again, we'll start with a sort of a general indication and then work into the specifics. So in terms of the broad attitudes, very positive, really encouraging. And what you have in terms of tackling food waste then is this high sense of personal responsibility. Consumers are concerned about food waste, and that concern translates into this openness to reducing their personal food waste. And then there's a but they need further direction, support, advice, guidance on how to do it. They are willing, but then there's this gap. So I'll give you an example just from one stat from the National Food Waste Survey, that you have an overwhelming amount of people, 84% in total, agreeing that everyone, including themselves, has a responsibility to minimize the food they throw away. Now, in terms of national attitudes, you're rarely, if ever, going to get a national incidence that goes beyond 84%. So in terms of agreement, that is wholesale national agreement. So let's talk then about this competency gap, this willingness to improve. And this will just give you an introduction to it. So you have these positive attitudes. But the gap I mentioned, what is it in particular I'm referring to? Well, it's this gap between intention and then ability to execute, activate that intention. So we gave people in the quantitative survey, there was a whole list of food management skills. I'll go into them later, that we presented to people, and we asked them to self-evaluate their own competency, how good they were in them, whether they were good or very good, and so on. And usually in a survey, you find people can be there can be a slight overconfidence bias. But actually in this test, consumers were quite self-critical. And you only had 37%, so just over 1 in 3, who rated their overall food management competency as either good or very good. So there's this, where we might have limitations in our understanding in terms of what food waste is, we're very, very good in indicating that, very honest in indicating that our skills in relation to managing food waste, our competency in this area, is really modest. However, in addition then to that self-critical evaluation, you have this very strong willingness to adopt new behaviors to bridge this gap. Now, there's a key thing here in that the behaviors, as we're going to go into, that they're most willing to adapt are quite simple, but they're deceptively simple in that they might appear small, but our assessments would indicate they can have a big impact and be really effective, and indeed the starting steps in a journey to lead to even further efficiencies. So just to give you an idea of what these willingness is, 84% are willing to do a quick check of their fridge and cupboards before shopping. You might say, well, that is a sort of, doing a little small audit of the food you have. People are willing to do that, but you would then be so surprised by the small percentage that actually do it. And then also the classic shopping list. 80% are willing to use a shopping list, but then you'd also be surprised by how low the incidence is in people actually using one, bringing one to the retail venue. So this signals that consumers are not resistant to change. And that's something we find so often in public studies around particular behaviors, that what you have to get over is this psychological resistance to actually change. But that does not apply here. Consumers have the intention and willingness to do so, and they are actively looking for straightforward ways to become better food managers and to save money and reduce their waste.
And that's kind of the crux of it. We're kind of pushing against an open door here, but what really, as we know, we're all very contradictory. So I suppose maybe dive a little bit deeper. You've been promising this now into that competency gap and kind of the skills that people think they're missing, and more importantly, kind of this willingness. I'm really fascinated by the willingness piece that, because unlike a lot of other environmental issues, we're not convincing them there is a problem here. We've got the motivation piece, and kind of it's how we make the most of that, and maybe how, we can support people, how we could, be have better systems to do the right thing.
Absolutely. It's all about these supports when you have this willingness, because in terms of behavioral change, as I've said, often the biggest challenge is actually evoking that willingness within people. But here you have it. Okay, let's start with the competency gap then, just to elaborate on this further. So we've mentioned general attitudes, really positive. However, let's get into this gap between intention and ability. And what that relates to is ability and people's modest self-evaluation of their own skills, this competency gap in people in the public's food management skills. And remember that figure overall assessment was that only 37% of people rate their overall competency as good or very good. So we aren't just saying very good, we're saying even people who are saying they were good at it. Let's give you an example. Um, Only 24% of people said they're very good at meal planning for the week. Just not something that people do with any frequency, because if they did, their self-evaluation would be much higher. And then on other assessments, it goes down even lower. So you have just over 1 in 10 people saying they measure ingredients for each person when preparing meals. Now, that's even, it's not a case of getting out the scales or so on. Maybe it's just an instinctive case using other tools like a cup or whatever it might be. Just only 1 in 10 people say they're very good at that. That's from the whole national audience. And then there's one thing of putting food in the freezer, then this idea of keeping a list of what you have put in the freezer. And again, we're at that 1 in 10 mark. Only 1 in 10 Irish adults suggest they're very good at that. So we're not talking about really expansive and in-depth skills here. But the instance in terms of competency is so low on a national basis. So that explains it really. You have these good intentions, but our modest national skills explain why food is often overpurchased and then underutilized when you're at home. And that double whammy then gives you the reason why we waste so much food. So that's where we are. But then the saving grace are these intentions, our future intentions. So that's the real positive news we have here, in that as national adults, we show this very strong and active willingness to adopt new behaviors to improve our food management. Not especially complex ones, but actually rather, indeed, in an objective case, simple ones. But these simple ones will have such a massive impact. So the key future intentions, let me give you a top five. Yeah, and you can see how high the national incidence is, the national willingness is to do each of these. So let's start from left to right. So 84% of us are willing to do a quick check of their fridge and cupboards before shopping. Okay, so not a rigorous audit, but just a quick check to get an indication of what's in the fridge, what's in the cupboards, and so on before we go shopping. 84%, overwhelming. In addition, then a further 80% of us are willing to use a shopping list to help us buy only the food we need. And you can see how one and two go hand in hand. And then a further 81% of us are willing to make small changes to how they manage the foods they waste the most. And a big one there, and actually the example we gave in the survey was freezing bread. And indeed, we're running a little survey on that with Odile and the team right now. And 81% of us are there in terms of, willing to use the freezer more as part of our food management activities. And then also versatile foods. So willing to buy versatile foods that they can plan several meals from. Now, remember, on the preceding chart, we saw that how low the percentage is of people who are that competently plan meals for the week. So that probably goes hand in hand with this one. But the idea of versatile foods and communicating to people what constitutes versatile foods and what the benefits of those versatile foods will be, you can see how compelling that could be for people. And then finally, actually a willingness to use not just the small, impromptu measuring devices, but formal measuring devices, so they could cook the right amount of food. You could imagine then how that could activate into promotions and so on in terms of what those devices are. 62% of us are willing to do that. So if that's if that's the gap and the high level intention, we also go into the shopping behaviors themselves that contribute to waste. And in store, there were these two key habits that stand out, two key behaviors that directly lead to food waste at home. And they're these. Consistently, we've seen that a really high incidence of people buy bigger packs than needed, often because they will say a smaller option isn't available. So number one, buying too big. The number two is buying out of habit, buying the same items every week out of habit before they do the check to see if they're actually needed. Again, reverting back to the finding we just looked at. People know they do this. 41% of us say we do this with frequency. And that prompts us to have this willingness to do just a quick check of what's in the fridge and the store cupboards, and to prepare a shopping list to avoid the very fact that we buy products that we don't need and then we bring them home and find that they were already sitting in the fridge. So what those findings do is they underscore, as you can imagine, the critical role of the retail environment as really as a starting point for much of the food that is actually wasted. So small, easy changes. Again, let's go back to this willingness and understanding people's receptiveness to it. So it wasn't just in the quantitative survey where the results were where we have the clear data on it to reveal how widespread. We also know how deep this sentiment goes from the qualitative study. And recurringly, throughout both those types of research, is how consumers are primed to adopt small, practical adjustments to their routines. A series of little things that together could be transformative. So We're conscious. People are not looking for a complete lifestyle overhaul. They're looking for tips, little things they can do. So, for instance, the high willingness to adopt simple planning behaviors indicate that the most effective interventions will be those that are low effort and easy to integrate into a busy life. So, in terms of our behavioral change desires, we're realistic in terms of what the type of things we can ask people to add to their routines, in the full knowledge that they have a very high willingness to adopt just those types of behaviors. Um, there's one other thing in this section, Odile, we'd like to go into, and that's the explicit link to packaging. You'll remember when I introduced the four studies that we reviewed for this report. One was explicitly on packaging and its link to food waste. And I want to give you an indication of what that says. Um, First of all, that survey established that there was this direct relationship between packaging formats and the volume of food waste in the home. So here's one of those links. That consumers who waste a large or moderate amount of fruit and vegetables are more likely to buy prepackaged. So those people who waste the most food are more likely to use prepackaged goods to buy them. And then the opposite was true, in that conversely, buying loose produce was perceived as a key strategy to avoid food waste. Those people who buy loose produce, 42% cited avoiding food waste as a key reason for doing so. So 42% of those people said packaging helps me avoid food waste, throwing away uneaten food. So it was people with that willingness who are making that explicit link between the volume of food they waste and the actual packaging they have. So, in terms of a consumer preference, there's this very clear desire for control and waste avoidance, and they explicitly make a link for that desire back to the packaging they actually see and use and prefer in store.
Thanks, John. That's really interesting. And that, we do have this eternal conundrum about packaging and food waste because obviously packaging has a role in preserving food. And then, but it's also to do with the quantities, having to buy prepackaged items too much. So it's interesting to see that come through. Just a reminder, if anyone has any questions for John, you can type them into the Q&A as we go along and we'll come to them at the end. But I suppose really now it's pull it all together and pull together maybe some of the key insights that are coming through from this research, and based on the things we've discussed, maybe some of the core strategic insights to take away.
Absolutely. So what I'd like to do in this section, Deal, is to do a situational analysis which focuses very much on what the key barriers are. We'll give you three key barriers. And then after that, we're going to summarize everything we've discussed and everything that was in the four reports into five key insights which we think are actionable, five key insights about the consumer. And then finally, we're just going to give you a little case study from the B2B study we did, which talks about really the importance of collaboration across the whole supply chain. So let's start with that situational analysis. And here are the core barriers we have to overcome. And there are three. There's the skills and knowledge gap, there's the environmental and retail hurdles, and there's the challenge of habit and overconfidence. Let's go through those one at a time. So in terms of the skill and knowledge gap, oh, sorry, let me go back to that. As we said, consumers lack key skills in meal planning, in portion control, and also freezer management. And then on top of that, a core area of confusion for them is date labels, understanding them correctly, and the misunderstanding leading them to discard what is ultimately perfectly good food. The second then barrier is around the environment, the retail environment. And that what you find there is it can hinder efforts and inclinations towards managing food waste through two key things: oversized packs and a lack of loose options. And then we move from the retail environment to the home environment. And there, what you have is this lack of order in two key areas of food storage: disorganized fridges and freezers. And particularly in relation to freezers, is that we ultimately forget what we've stored in the freezer. So those two environments, both the retail and the home, working against our ability to and desire to waste less food. And then we have our well-established, the final barriers are well-established behavioral patterns, ultimately habit. But in addition to habit, the habit is really in some ways a function of this overconfidence we have. And a key part there is that there's a conscious motivation to save money, and it's strong. However, it's often overridden by these well-established habits we have in relation to food, both in the home and elsewhere. And in addition to that, then you have this tendency for people to underestimate their own waste. And they do that because they also can misdefine what waste is. When you have that overestimation, when you have that sort of confidence bias, if you like, that dilutes the urgency to change. So if we can get people to have a clear self-assessment of where they actually are, just like they provided when we asked them to assess their own competency levels, if we get them to understand how much food they actually waste, then there'll be far greater urgency for change. So if those are the key barriers, let's then do a related point in terms of 5 key insights from this study. And we really see these insights as the areas where 3 things intersect: consumer behavior, market trends, and commercial interests. So there's a say-to gap. Insight 2 is around financial messaging. Insight 3 is around the food management gap. Insight 4 is that the public is primed for small, easy changes. And then insight 5 is around the direct connection between packaging choices in store and food waste. Okay, so say-to gap. And then related to that is overconfidence and how that's a key barrier. We consistently underestimate our own food waste. In the quantitative survey, we had 71% of people believe they waste only a small amount. The figure I used earlier was this 29% of people who understand that they waste at least a moderate amount of food. The flip side of that is that the balance, 71% believe they only waste a small amount of food. Whereas when we went into people's homes with the ethnographic research, it revealed a completely different reality. When we asked people in that study to track their own waste, they were consistently surprised, often shocked, by the actual amount of food they discarded. So, at the heart of this barrier is this self-perception issue, this overconfidence bias that as a person, I don't waste a lot of food, where the reality is, I really do. Then, in terms of the second insight, it's really what informs the communications we use to trigger the behavior change that we're primed for. And it's financial messaging is the strongest lever. When we tested the message that an average household wastes 700 euros worth of food per year, that was the one that makes the biggest impression on people. Even more so than the explicit link between food waste and global greenhouse gases. People have strong environmental concerns. But in terms of financial saving, that kind of practical, pragmatic sentiment is really effective accompaniment. So this linking of financial savings and food waste is ultimately the most compelling message for people we've found in relation to changing their behaviors for food waste. And that sentiment and the importance of financial messaging is also directly mirrored in the B2B survey, where across all the businesses we were looking at, cost reduction was and is the primary driver for waste minimization. So your communications, whether they're directed to the public or to businesses, will invariably benefit while leading with the financial benefits of reducing food waste. Okay, the food management gaps we've talked about. Let's just summarize this again. We're willing to act, but we lack the skills. Only a third of us rate ourselves as good as very good at the food management skills, and our key weaknesses are measuring portions, planning meals for the week, and keeping track of freezer contents. Absolute key weaknesses. And there is therefore a clear need for initiatives focused on building practical, step-by-step skills for planning, shopping, storing, and user food. Consumers will love you for it. They know these are the gaps. They know these impact on their efficiencies at home, and their willingness to adopt these skills is sky high if we give them advice and guidance and tips and techniques to do so. And here's the point about the willingness. We are primed to adapt our behavior in small and easy changes. So, overwhelming public willingness to change behavior in this area, and in particular to adopt simple, low-effort behaviors. So what examples of that? A whopping 84% of us are willing to do a quick check of our fridges and cupboards before shopping, and then 80% are willing to use a shopping list. And when you have those little gateway behaviors, they're these small, accessible, easy entry points. And once you do those, then you build a household's confidence over time, and then you create momentum. And then down the road, they'll be more ready and able and confident to adopt more complex changes. But that's where you start, and that's where consumers want to start. And then finally, just in terms of the insights, we've reviewed then how packaging choices directly influence food waste. Consumers who are the big wasters of food are much more likely to buy prepackaged, and they prefer prepackaged options. Conversely, those people who are most keen to reduce their food waste and to avoid food waste are much more likely to buy loose produce. And one of the reasons they do that is the very reason that they want to avoid wasting food. So if you have initiatives that encourage the sale of loose produce, they can be framed as a powerful tool for both packaging reduction and food waste prevention, and that'll create a dual benefit, and consumers will respond very well to those. Okay. So if those would be our 5 concluding insights. Just to finish with a case study from the business study that we did, a series of interviews with relevant people and managers in the food manufacturing area. And what they were talking about there, these key managers in food manufacturing, where they're talking about the importance of the wider ecosystem. And their central point was the size of the opportunity that exists for collaboration. So and collaboration that would deliver reducing waste across the entire food industry. So it was suggested that by moving beyond a siloed approach, where we all work in our own areas, all partners can unlock shared efficiencies and create mutual value. So closer collaboration between manufacturers and retailers can turn the challenge of aligning production with demand into an opportunity. And they gave an example. So, for example, you had some of them were already working together to turn unsold products into new resources, which was creating a win-win. And again, we go back to this willingness, which was evident on the consumer side, but was also very evident on the B2B side. There was a strong industry-wide appetite for greater partnership on food waste, clear desire for collaborative forums, knowledge-sharing platforms to jointly develop solutions, turning the shared challenge of food waste into a collective success story and a more resilient, efficient supply chain for everyone, which also was saving money.
Oh, thanks, John. That's really interesting, and I think from a consumer perspective, this as we mentioned, to hear about the willingness, the strong motivation, and we come across that in our work through the Food Waste Charter as well. An awful lot of businesses actually want to deal with this issue, and I think just in terms of the of sticking with the consumers for now, obviously they have this willingness, but it's coupled with some strong habits and overconfidence that has to be overcome. And I'm just wondering, given your experience, you have expertise working with the retail sector and tracking grocery trends. Do you see some strong opportunities here for to create the right environment and support people to adopt good behaviors?
Yeah, we do. Like we confine our research. We do a lot of research in the grocery area, um, but I think we can even confine our comments in relation to EPA studies. Like another EPA study we do, which we're very proud to be a part of, is the enormous survey you do about climate change in the Irish mind. Um, and the commercial case for climate action is clear from that. So it's not just being green, it's about gaining and retaining customers. So from that massive national survey, we know that over half of Irish adults actively choose to buy from a company that took climate action in the past year. That's big. So people are making commercial consumer choices based on the green credentials of their suppliers. And conversely, you had over 40% of consumers actively avoided companies they saw as inactive in the space. So the commercial case in terms of customer loyalty is very, very clear from that study. Um, and in addition to that, Ben, you have that food waste is a top of mind customer concern. The price of food is understandably the number one issue for shoppers. But food waste is a very close second. You have 53% of your customers citing it as a key concern. Um, and they see the connection. There's a huge majority link throwing away edible food directly to climate change. So they make the connection between food waste and climate change. And I can reassure you it's a top of mind customer concern. Um, and the other thing in we talked about so often in the studies that I do with Cormac, we see this there's a lack of will for people to adopt certain behaviors because their attitudes are have to follow. The core problem here is a competency gap. It's not a lack of will. And here's the central paradox of that. People want to do the right thing. So 84% feel a personal responsibility to reduce waste. But remember, only 37% of people feel that they have general skills in this area. Um, so that's it. Those are those are key points. There are others if you'd like me to go into them.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I think in terms of the retail environment, like packaging and portioning are key levers for change. So people see a direct link between packaging and waste. And customers who are most active, um, who waste a lot of fruit and veg, they're the most likely to buy prepackaged. And conversely, as we've said, those who are more interested in loose packaging tend to be especially keen to avoid food waste. Um, and if you're looking, to target a group, which I know can be very helpful, like what we're saying is any initiatives around food waste absolutely have national validity because it's a top of mind concern for consumers. But there's also a clear target audience for support in that the research clearly shows that waste levels peak among younger shoppers. They're the ones who are most likely to report that they waste large amounts of food. And who is this group? Well, as retailers will well know, they're time poor, they're digitally very sophisticated, they're less experienced just as a function of age in terms of food management. Like they're a prime audience for targeted support, whether that's through loyalty apps or online content or convenient in-store initiatives solutions. Um, and further, maybe the final point just to make here is that just to confirm that the strongest motivator is financial savings. It isn't, absolute core communication from retailers to encourage customer visits, customer loyalty around the financial savings. Um, and that also applies to food waste. While customers care about the environment, we know that very well. the most powerful message in relation to food waste is financial. Remember, it was when we said that the amount of money you can save, a household can save a year by reducing food waste, was the single biggest motivator for change. And that sentiment, that message, it aligns perfectly with a retailer's core mission to provide value. And so it makes it an authentic and powerful message for retailers to make in their marketing comms.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And I suppose, we have been working with the retailers over the years. And in fact, the Food Waste Charter was first established with the food retail sector. But what we have been doing, I suppose, is sharing our messaging with the Stop Food Waste campaign. So obviously, we have been informed by our research, coming up with the messages that we want to promote to people. And, some of the retailers promote that through their own social media channels as well, so that we're reaching their audiences. But I do think, yeah, it's really interesting. There's so much more opportunity, all the other contact points that customers have with retailers where they could receive these prompts, and even just like that by changing labeling and packaging. And so, and I think it's an area we'd love to explore with retailers through the usual collaborative channels that we have. And in particular also, as you mentioned, with that kind of the wider supply chain as well, where this is how we're actually going to achieve that transformational change that is going to be required to actually reduce food waste as well. I think at this point we might stop